The hearing will come to order. It's my intention that this will be the first in a number of hearings that the subcommittee will hold on the issue of international maritime piracy. Given its significance to our national security as well as its consequences for the global economy. Earlier this month, our nation watched as the Maersk, Alabama was hijacked off the coast of Somalia, and an American citizen who's here in Washington today, by the way, Captain Richard Phillips, he's over on the other side, as we say, who happens also to be a graduate of the Massachusetts Maritime Academy, one of, I think, the finest maritime academy anywhere, happens to be in my district on Cape Cod. Well, as we all know, he was held hostage for a number of days in a lifeboat. And shortly after his heroic rescue, another American vessel, the Liberty Sun, was also attacked by Somali pirates, making good on the pirates' threat to target and attack American ships. While the Liberty Sun avoided the Maersk, Alabama's fate, the attack is only further evidence that international piracy is an ongoing threat and must be addressed and should be addressed quickly. While today the focus of public attention is off the coast of Somalia, some 5 years ago the hotspot was, in terms of piracy, was in the Straits of Malacca. 5 years from now, it will likely be elsewhere in the world. And that underscores that it is imperative that we work to devise, design, if you will, an international architecture, an infrastructure, a blueprint that can permanently be utilized to deal with the threat of piracy wherever and whenever it emerges. As I've been reading on this issue, I've come to learn that there appears to be no silver bullet, no panacea, no easy answer. And it's important, I believe, for us to listen to all of the various parties, the stakeholders, and to educate ourselves on the array of international issues implicated in maritime piracy. Piracy presents a particularly difficult task because it's not only an American problem, but an international problem that will need a coordinated response from the global community. Now, there are multiple opinions on how we can address this issue. Some, like General Petraeus, have suggested we place armed guards on merchant vessels. Others have claimed that this would only increase the danger to seafarers. Well, instinctually, I'm inclined to agree with General Petraeus. What I do know is that this will be a multifaceted problem that will require the full energy and engagement of the United States Congress. And if we fail to act now, piracy will continue to flourish and will have a political and economic and humanitarian impact around the world. Now, this subcommittee is tasked with the duty of oversight, which is a responsibility that I and my friend and colleague and ranking member, Mr. Rohrabacher, take most seriously. It will fall to this subcommittee to ensure that appropriate actions are being taken to address this serious problem, and that we are working in a way to protect our national security and particularly American citizens while at sea. I am pleased to have learned that the State Department has moved very aggressively under the direction of Secretary Clinton to confront this challenge. The United Nations and our superb Navy and Coast Guard forces are also playing a key role in rising to the challenge. So this truly is an international problem that requires an international solution. We do not, nor should we, carry the burden alone. Now let me just turn to my friend and colleague, the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for any statements he may care to make. Dana?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. It's been an issue that has actually been around a lot longer than most Americans think. I can remember reading about this 20, 30 years ago in various parts of the world, including the part of the world that we've just recently been alerted to. So I would like to remind the chairman that as long as we've been on this committee, we've been hearing people who have come to us and have pointed out how U.S. development assistance is wasted quite often when it goes directly to a foreign government. And quite often the governments, especially in these developing countries, are corrupt or ineffective or incompetent. But sometimes we have learned, and quite often we have learned, that providing aid to these people and making things better in a given area requires not going directly to the government, but instead directing resources toward the problem specifically. The more efficient use of our assistance quite often is going through private organizations or the private sector rather than to affected governments. For this reason, I believe that military assistance in the form of training or transferring used Coast Guard ships to various African nations makes no sense and will prove to be ineffective. I believe instead we must provide assistance that will make a difference, that is done through the private sector in some way that will directly attack this problem. For example, there are private sector alternatives, such as Blackwater and other organizations that are set up basically as for such purposes as we're talking about. We've been using them most recently and as guards for and security details for our diplomats overseas, but they have capability of actually going in and providing security details for ships who are transporting themselves through hostile waters. These organizations, again, they're just like NGOs, and they have their specific purpose in mind, and they could, and I believe, provide an effective use of our resources to combat a problem and creating American jobs at the same time. Most people in these private organizations like Blackwater have people who know the language and the culture in order to get the job done and have many, many years of experience as compared to simply training some people in for example, in this case, an African country, training people who have, and expecting that 5 months of training or 3 months of training and some equipment supplies is going to make a large difference and enable them to meet a very serious challenge. So my guess is that we shouldn't be wasting taxpayers' money in Africa by sending it to corrupt governments. But instead, let's see if we can find a way, as we do in humanitarian efforts, to send Americans or the equivalent of NGOs right at the problem by hiring these folks who can do the job. And by hiring private organizations, we will know exactly where the money is being spent and exactly what is being accomplished in a very measurable way, rather than giving money through governments which quite often you never know what happens once the money is transferred into their bank account. So with that said, I'm looking forward to being briefed on the nature of the problem and perhaps going over a few ideas for solutions, as I have just mentioned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Dana, and it might come as a surprise to you, but I don't know if I disagree with you. This is remarkable.
This is going to be a really boring hearing.
This will be our hearings, and I would inform our witnesses that during the course of the previous term, this subcommittee conducted some 52 hearings. This happens to be our first. Maybe we're just tired, Dana, at this point in time. But this is a serious issue, and let me be very candid. I'm coming to this to learn and to listen to all of the stakeholders, as I've said. I have some concerns, particularly about what I perceive to be a program that is more attuned to recreational or commercial fishermen catch and release. But I'm sure that will be addressed. By catch and release, I mean while pirates have been apprehended, when they are, it would appear that in many, many cases that there's a practice of releasing them, if not forthwith, once in a very short time frame. But enough said. Let me introduce our witnesses. You know, as I said, having served in the Coast Guard myself, it's a particular honor to welcome Admiral Baumgartner here today. I want you to know I was a radar man third class, and it gives me great pleasure to look down on an admiral at this point in time. He serves as the Judge Advocate General and General Counsel of the United States Coast Guard. In this capacity, he is the Coast Guard's senior legal advisor and is responsible for all aspects of the Coast Guard's legal program. He's a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, holds an MBA from the University of New Orleans, and a law degree, magna cum laude, from Harvard Law School. I also understand he was an editor on the Law Review, a considerable achievement. And next, I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Stephen Mull, Senior Advisor to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs of the U.S. State Department. Ambassador Mull has oversight responsibility for the Office of the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs and its related State Department bureaus. Among other positions, he previously served as Acting Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs from January 2007 until August 2008, and as UN Ambassador to Lithuania from 2003 until 2006. He's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service in the class of Minister Counselor. And I don't know if my colleague is aware, but our friend from and colleague from California, Ellen Tauscher, has been nominated by the President to be Ambassador Mull's boss. I know that you will find it a great experience working with Congresswoman, soon to be Secretary Tauscher. But let's proceed, and this is a very informal process that we have in this subcommittee. It's really, as Dana Robacher has said, it's the committee without rules, which means that you can take as much time as you want, given the fact there's only two of you, and we will attempt to conclude this hearing in time for you, Ambassador Mull, to make your 2:15 appointment. Why don't we begin with Ambassador Mull?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, for the opportunity to come and meet with you and, in fact, in an informal setting, discuss this really important challenge. I think in the interest of your time and in the interest of moving towards a more free-flowing exchange of ideas back and forth, because we're very eager to hear your ideas. I would ask that my formal testimony be entered into the record, and I'll just provide a quick overview
Without objection.
of what's in it. It's a very interesting problem of piracy in Somalia, because it features a convergence of really the very first national interest of the United States from our very founding, very important to Massachusetts, of ensuring freedom of the seas. And it converges with this very 21st century phenomenon of asymmetric threats to our security interests. And this convergence is all through the prism of the need to keep energy flowing and keep humanitarian supplies flowing to one of the simultaneously most destitute and most strategically important corners of the globe. Our approach within the administration, we have basically one strategic goal. We want to protect America's right and the world's right to freedom of the seas through enhanced international cooperation in stopping these pirate attacks and building a lasting maritime security regime that we think will serve all of our interests in the end. Now, we've adopted a number of tactics in pursuit of that goal. We worked very closely in the United Nations to pass a series of UN Security Council resolutions, most recently on December 16th, UN Security Council Resolution 1851, which in fact granted significant authority to the international community to intervene to stop pirate attacks. We've also, right on the heels of that, took the lead in creating an international contact group on the threat of piracy off the coast of Somalia that has grown to include 28 states and 6 international organizations, and which has met regularly since the beginning of the year. We've encouraged increased ship deployments, both through our own example and our own U.S. Navy and Coast Guard presence there in the region, but also working with other states to the point where we have recently had as many as 40 ships patrolling this area. We've established a maritime security protective area through which ships can transit under greater security conditions. We've worked, a big problem, as we can talk about later, is figuring out what to do with the pirates once we apprehend them. And so we've worked to secure an agreement with Kenya that Kenya will gladly take the pirates that we apprehend and prosecute them. We also have a number of other discussions going on with other states in the region to do the same thing. And of course, as in the case of Captain Phillips, we are going to be prosecuting the pirate that survived the rescue attempt. The Coast Guard and the Maritime Administration have, as the Admiral will mention, have done an exemplary job of working with the industry, because they have to play a very important role in their own defense against these attacks. And I think we've achieved quite a bit there, especially under the Coast Guard's leadership. We also can't lose sight of the fact that piracy is really a symptom of a much broader problem in Somalia that's going to take a lot of international attention and resources to fix. And so we have enhanced our activism on on that basket of issues as well. I think the combination of these tactics has produced some success already. We, just since January 1st, all the various ships participating in this effort have succeeded in 15 interdictions of pirate vessels. This is in contrast to only 8 in all of 2008. So already we've just about doubled. We're not even halfway through the year yet. We've doubled successful interdictions. And we've apprehended a number of pirates. 52 of them are now awaiting trial in Kenya. But in spite of those successes, there's a lot of challenges. This is a wide swath of sea, 1.5 million square nautical miles, depending on where you draw the boundaries. And so, no amount of ships is ever going to prevent every attack of piracy. We also, as you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, have problems with all of the countries. There's a broad consensus in participating in this common effort to deter pirate attacks, but each country has their own set and their own understanding of what their national legal authorities are. And so we feel very comfortable as Americans apprehending pirates on the high seas. and bringing them to trial. Other countries do not, and so we're working to try and fill those gaps to make sure that catch and release won't happen in the future. Since the attack on the Alabama, Secretary Clinton and President Obama have asked that we work much harder in a number of directions. And so what we're in the process of looking forward to now in the next couple of weeks is we're going to convene an emergency session of the contact group that I mentioned earlier. It will meet in New York in a few weeks' time. And at that meeting, we're going to press contributors for even more forces in the region to the extent that they can contribute. We're going to identify those gaps that I talked about to eliminate catch and release so that when pirates are caught, they are delivered swiftly to justice. We are going to press very hard that victims have a responsibility in pursuing prosecutions. That if a country's vessel is attacked, we believe that flag state of that vessel has a responsibility to pursue justice against those pirates, so we're not funneling all of the pirates to places like Kenya. In other words, share the responsibility a little bit more broadly. We're also exploring very preliminarily with our colleagues in the Treasury Department what we might be able to do to track and freeze assets of pirates. This, of course, is very difficult because asset flows to pirates are typically contained in suitcases stuffed with $100 bills or euros flung onto the decks of ships from helicopters as a part of ransom payments. But nevertheless, we believe that there are some directions that we can work, probably not appropriate to discuss in this setting, but we're looking at it very carefully. And then finally, you may ask, why is, despite all these efforts, why are the number of attacks going up? Well, the point is people have been paying ransom and enabling pirates to buy more sophisticated weapons, to organize themselves better. We're redoubling our efforts with our particularly our European allies, to say there should be no concessions to pirates. There's significant opposition to this because people believe, some believe it's an acceptable business cost, others believe that you don't want to put human lives in jeopardy, and in fact pirates have not really been taking lives up until now. So it's something that we're going to keep discussing. It's a difficult problem. It is difficult and complex, as we talked about, Mr. Chairman, at the beginning, but the truth is we have something really strong going for us, and that's a strong international consensus that this is something that threatens all of us, and we really hope that we can build on that consensus to overcome some of these practical difficulties and make a real impact in shutting down this threat, not only to us and our citizens, but really to the world shipping community as well as the states in the region. So I'll stop there and look very much forward to hearing your ideas and answering your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Admiral Baumgartner.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Rohrabacher, before I begin, I want to assure the Chairman that any good admiral understands and knows in his soul that the third-class petty officers do the real work of the Coast Guard, not the admirals. And you have my admiration for your service in doing the actual real work of the Coast Guard. I do appreciate the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee to discuss piracy and the Coast Guard's role in addressing this threat to freedom of navigation, the safety of international shipping, and I think most importantly, the lives of the seafarers who are so crucial to our international economy. And I do ask that my written statement be included in the record.
Without objection. And Admiral, I just want to recognize the presence of our colleague from New Jersey, who happens to chair the Africa Subcommittee, not happens to, but has really made a significant contribution over time to Congress's understanding of issues implicated in the continent of Africa, and that's Mr. Don Payne.
Good afternoon, sir.
Please proceed.
Piracy is one of the oldest universal crimes, and under international law, every nation has the legal authority to bring pirates to justice. This authority, however, does not guarantee success, and coordinated international action, as the Ambassador mentioned, is essential. The national strategy for countering piracy off the Horn of Africa acknowledges that lasting solutions require significant improvements in the governance, rule of law, that's critical, security and economic development of Somalia. However, there are a lot of steps that can be taken in the near term, and the national strategy lays out these steps in 3 basic lines of action. The first entails preventative and precautionary measures to render piracy less attractive. Most importantly, measures to make commercial vessels more difficult targets for pirates. In this regard, the United States and the Coast Guard have worked closely with our government and industry partners via the International Maritime Organization, ad hoc consultations, the International Contact Group on Piracy off the coast of Somalia. We're doing this to produce practical and effective solutions. Nothing illustrates the inextricable link between safety and security like the issue of piracy. And I would stress that this is critically important because once the pirates are on board the vessel, as we all know, the dynamic on the water changes considerably, and the dangers to the crew of the vessel and the vessel itself go up dramatically once the pirates are on board and in control. The second line of action focuses on operations to interrupt and terminate piracy. Toward this end, as we all know, the Central Command has established Combined Task Force 151 to deter, disrupt, and suppress piracy in this region. For several months, Coast Guard law enforcement detachments have been operating under this Combined Task Force, augmenting and training U.S. naval vessel boarding search and seizure teams in various maritime interdiction operations mission areas. Currently, the Coast Guard 378-foot high-endurance cutter Boutwell is operating under Combined Task Force 151 and will be conducting counter-piracy operations in this area. The third line of action focuses on effective prosecution of pirates. Specific measures include the development of regional anti-piracy agreements, promotion of existing international agreements such as the Convention for the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against the Safety of Maritime Navigation, that's a mouthful, but we call it SUA for short, and also the enhancement of regional partner capabilities. These efforts are well underway. In January, as the Ambassador mentioned, the United States signed an MOU with Kenya, under which Kenya will accept custody of suspects and seize property for either trial in their country or transfer to another. Kenya has already agreed to prosecute several pirates captured by joint U.S. Coast Guard Navy teams. Under similar arrangements, the United Kingdom, European Union countries have also turned pirates over to Kenya to be tried in their courts. The SUA Convention I mentioned before is a valuable tool in these efforts. Earlier this year, at a meeting convened by the International Maritime Organization in Djibouti, 21 regional nations adopted an agreement for cooperation in the interdiction, investigation, and prosecution of pirates, as well as the establishment of information and training centers. Although not eligible to be a party to this instrument, the U.S. delegation, led by the Coast Guard, played an important supporting role in the effort. We sincerely hope that there'll be other nations that step up, as Kenya has done, and provide additional support in the region. As the nation's primary maritime safety and law enforcement agency and a branch of the armed forces, Coast Guard has a unique and significant role in responding to piracy. Coast Guard leads U.S. anti-piracy efforts at the International Maritime Organization. The service establishes and enforces requirements for vessel security plans under the Maritime Transportation Security Act and the International Ship and Port Facility Code. In the recent incidents with the Maersk Alabama and the Liberty Sun, the plans that those vessels and those companies developed pursuant to the Maritime Transportation Security Act were critical in their successful responses to those pirate attacks. And one of the things that has been highlighted many times, and I just would want to stress again, is that those masters of those vessels practiced those plans over and over again, drilled their crews, and I'm most familiar with the Maersk Alabama, but the crew executed the plan exactly as they were supposed to, and that was absolutely critical to the positive result in that case. Both the International Maritime Organization and the Coast Guard are currently revising our directives on piracy-specific security measures. Just Monday, we presented a proposal for revised measures to a group of industry leaders, and we are waiting their feedback on those specific new security measures. In addition, we engage in international training to enhance the capacity of other nations to take action against pirates, both in their waters and in their courts. Significantly, the Coast Guard has just published a revised Model Maritime Service Code that developing nations may use as a template to establish the laws and institutions necessary to counter piracy. This is particularly important, as the Ambassador noted. The international law regime is very robust in the area of piracy. However, where it falls down or may fall down on occasion is whether individual nations have adopted the domestic law that they need to do their role in suppressing piracy. The Model Maritime Service Code, one of its goals is to give a template to those countries so that they can establish the right domestic laws with the right jurisdiction the right agencies and so forth to take action on piracy and other similar types of crimes at sea. As I conclude, I want to emphasize piracy is a multifaceted threat. The response requires a broad array of legal authorities, operational capabilities, skills, and competencies, as well as the participation of numerous U.S. government, international, and commercial entities. The Coast Guard is an armed force, our principal maritime law enforcement agency, and our principal regulatory agency for maritime safety and security, has a unique role to play and remains committed to this effort. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee, and I look forward to questions and dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Admiral. And like I said, we're very informal here, so this is more of a conversation. And if a question is posed to one and the other witness has a desire to interrupt, please feel free to do that. You indicate that the problem is with the domestic legal authorities in terms of the prosecution of those that are apprehended. It's my understanding that even absent conventions, the SUA, the Geneva Convention, that it's customary international law that piracy in and of itself confers jurisdiction and the right to prosecute individual nation states. But I guess what you're telling me is that other nations would require some sort of domestic legal authority and could not proceed just simply under customary international law to prosecute those that were apprehended. Is that a correct statement? Am I misstating it, or am I misunderstanding?
No,
Admiral?
sir. I think that's pretty accurate. Here in the United States, despite the fact that we would have authority under the 1958 Geneva Convention on the High Seas, for example, or the SUA Convention, we would have international authority to take action here. If we did not have the actual sections in Title 18 of the U.S. Code, we would not necessarily have a crime to prosecute in our court. There are other specific procedural issues that come up from time to time with different nations. If the nation is not prepared to prosecute, should I say, far-flung or crimes that are committed away from their shores, say on the high seas or other places, they will find that there are sometimes procedural impediments that in their own criminal processes where they simply don't or haven't thought ahead or aren't prepared to deal with a delay in between the arrest of an individual and the time they're brought in front of a court, and many other particular issues like that. In the United States, I can speak to some things in particular. We do have these regimes in place, and for that I think we can thank the narcotics business. We have the Maritime Law Enforcement, the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, right, which has forward-leaning and forward-thinking jurisdictional provisions and does accommodate those kinds of difficult and unusual scenarios. That's the type of thing that is lacking from time to time in different countries' domestic laws.
Ambassador?
And I would add, in addition to agreeing with everything the Admiral said, there are often very discrete policy or political questions involved as well. Some national prosecutors will decide, well, yes, we recognize that an attack on the high seas is something that we could prosecute, but our nationals weren't involved. None of our flagged ships were attacked in this. Even though we might have detained or somehow apprehended these pirates, we're not going to prosecute them because we don't have the resources to do it. And then there are other political questions. There's an anecdote I'd like to tell about one of our own Navy ships that picked up a Somali pirate, was kept on board in the brig, and he started knocking and wanting to talk to somebody, and one of the officers of the ship went down and said yes, and the detainee said, this brig is much nicer than where I live in Somalia. May my family please come and stay with me here? And it illustrates, it's partly funny, but it also illustrates that for many people, if you arrest them and then take them into custody, there may be national laws that prevent their return. If they're found not guilty, they'll say that they face persecution or terrible living conditions in Somalia, they would like asylum, or they will just remain there in the country then and become a problem for that particular nation. So all of these combinations of things really make many countries reluctant to play an activist role. But we think there's a responsibility that we have commonly to ensure freedom of the seas, and so we're going to keep working with our partners to show them the templates that the Admiral mentioned and to keep policy pressure on them to change their approach.
It would appear, you indicated that there is maybe I'm, again, not describing it accurately, but a model legislation that's used in an effort to have other nation states adopt so that the proper domestic legal authority exists. And I didn't hear, is that been produced by the Coast Guard, or is it a product of the Office of Legal Counsel of the State Department, or is it, where was it generated? I think you referenced it, Admiral.
Yes, sir. There may be many things, many products that help along these lines. What I was referring to is a product that the Coast Guard produces that's called the Model Maritime Service Code, and it is designed to be to run the full gamut of what a country would need to set up their marine safety regime, their fisheries enforcement regime, their maritime law enforcement regime, maritime security, would extend to piracy, counter-drug operations, would also have a template on what type of agency they might set up to do the same kind of thing as well. So it's actually a fairly robust document, but it does have the specific things in there that a country...
But it does not provide, if you will, a model law that could be emulated or replicated in other nation states.
Oh, yes, sir, it does.
Oh, it does?
It does, yes, sir. Depending upon the legal structure in a particular country, they could take sections of it simply verbatim and enact it. It's designed that way.
You know, what I found interesting is that we're talking some Western democracies. I think I just read recently the Netherlands, apprehended and then in a relatively short period of time released a number of, of these pirates. And it became an issue of, public debate, political debate in the Netherlands. And it's also my understanding that Russia has apprehended, again, a number of pirates, and a decision has not been made as to how their cases should be disposed of. I wonder if they've reached a decision. You have that on one hand, and then you have the French taking a much more aggressive approach than it would appear that the United States and the United Kingdom are. Am I describing that accurately? And am I correct in stating that there's a lot of work to do to create a consistent legal regimen or regime in terms of how these cases should be investigated and prosecuted, and some sort of understanding as to an appropriate sanction, which from my perspective should be very severe, simply to send a message that there is a significant consequence for this kind of behavior.
When we began our diplomacy in January to create this contact group of countries that were going to coordinate their efforts, we successfully persuaded our European partners that this was a major flaw in the world's response to piracy, and we persuaded them to agree to establish a legal working group that met in Copenhagen in March to start examining these discrepancies. And then we're going to be meeting again next week, again in the same group, to see how far we've come and to identify these.
Is this one of those that if I may?
Please.
I think I read where there are 4 working groups.
That's right.
And I take it this is one of them?
It's working group number 2.
Working group, and who is the lead in that working group? The Danes?
The Danes have been the convener of this, but they're rotating. Every time it meets, there's a different host who organizes the meeting and pulls it together. And the State Department the U.S. government is represented at these deliberations.
And who's representing the United States?
We have been sending an assistant legal advisor of the State Department, Sue Binyas, to participate in those.
And can you
with
tell?
interagency participation.
Right. I take it the Coast Guard is represented there as well.
We've been heavily involved in the run-up and the preparations and so forth. So yes.
Are we making progress, Ambassador? I guess is the question.
Well, as you might imagine, pulling together 28 countries and trying to get them to be more like us is always a challenge. But it's slow progress. But I think there is progress in terms of identifying the gaps. I'll tell you what helps a lot is the high profile that this issue has gotten in the press. We've noticed just since the Alabama case, in the meetings we've had, particularly with our European partners, there's much more readiness to talk with us about the dangers from ransom, about the dangers of catch and release. And just after the incident with the Dutch that you described, sir, the Dutch foreign minister met with Secretary Clinton and told the press that the Netherlands is going to be doing better on questions like this in the future. So I'm optimistic.
Do you agree or disagree with this statement that if we don't solve this particular problem, this might be the most significant problem in terms of dealing? And I'm not saying that, even if we do our best in terms of best practices, in terms of intervention, in terms of dealing with Somalia as a failed state, all of those issues, if we don't have a coherent legal regime that imposes substantial sanctions to serve as deterrence, we're going to continue to have problems. I mean, I would presume that, a pirate who's released goes back to Somalia and is in the next skiff out. And I think it's important. Let me ask you this question. A, do you agree with that, both of you? And how can we, Congress, play a role? I was musing that, clearly, particularly this committee, but other committees too, often engage in interparliamentary exchanges. I know that, Congressman Rohrabacher and I have been in Russia. We traveled together. We've been in Germany, simply to raise this issue with our counterparts in the Duma or in the German Bundestag. Does that aid or does that reinforce what you're attempting to do? And let me hear your response.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I completely agree that this is an absolutely vital key to solving the problem. So I think you've perceived it exactly right. And in terms of what the Congress can do, I think through your international engagement on the trips that you make overseas, in the interparliamentary fora that you participate in, I think you could really help a lot by publicizing and drawing your counterparts' attention to the need to have a more harmonious legal approach. Because this isn't the responsibility of the United States or of Russia or Netherlands. It's really all of our responsibility, and we need a common set of tools and authorities and capabilities if we're going to succeed.
I would note that this particular committee has jurisdiction over multilateral organizations, including the United Nations, which obviously implicate the IMO. And I know Mr. Rohrabacher and I would be and I'm speaking for him here, would be more than willing to observe, participate, and support, you know, the executive's efforts at the UN, with the IMO, or any other organization. With that, let me yield to my friend, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. How many people have lost their lives? Have we had these pirates killing some of the people that they've taken over some of these ships in the last year or so?
There have been a couple of sailors who have died, not because they were executed by the pirates, but because they were ill, and so there have been no hostages, at least in the last 2 years, that have lost their lives because they were executed by pirates.
Okay, but so there's been ransom paid, and thus the ransom was paid and the hostages weren't killed. Has there been anyone who hasn't paid the ransom and having the people released?
Well, certainly we didn't pay ransom for the Maersk Alabama, and I don't think we ever would. Beyond that, Bill, do you know? I'm not.
Okay.
Obviously, I mean, the French have launched some operations as well to.
But I mean,
take vessels,
but it's not been released by us, but by an act. But if there's been a situation where the pirates captured someone, asked for a ransom, they weren't given the ransom, but the pirates just gave up and let them go?
There's no incident that I'm aware of at all, and some of the vessels have been held there quite some time. I'm just looking here at a list. There's some that were captured in August and are still being held. I think that from an economic standpoint, the vessel owners looking at the hostages there, you know, it's paying the ransom is an expedient way to get their vessel back, to get their crew members released, to get the cargo back on its way to.
Well, I'm sure that they are very concerned, the pirates who are holding these hostages, with the legal working group in Copenhagen. I'm sure they're just sitting on the edge of their chair waiting for the report before they make up their mind if they're going to take hostages. Is there any relationship between these terrorists, between terrorist organizations, especially Islamic terrorist organizations, and these Somali pirates?
There has been no indication. It's a question that we examine very critically every single day. And thus far, we have not seen any evidence of a link. The Al-Shabaab group in Somalia, in fact, has made pronouncements against the pirates. Since the incident with the Maersk Alabama, there were threats that from some of the pirates who said that they would now ensure retaliation, violent retaliation against American interests. Whether or not terrorist groups could perceive of that as an opportunity to get themselves involved in piracy is a very real concern that we continue to watch, but we haven't seen that link yet.
So is your testimony the Al-Shabaab group is not, you do not have evidence of them being engaged with the Somali pirates?
No.
Okay.
Would the gentleman yield for a minute?
Certainly.
I think I read somewhere where there was criticism from that particular group, or possibly another, that condemned the piracy attacks as being un-Islamic. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I yield back.
Okay. Here's a quote from Sheikh Hassan Abdullah Hashuri al-Turki, the leader of the Al-Shabaab-linked, whatever they call this group. It's a group, I cannot pronounce it, but it's been designated by the State Department as a terrorist organization. And this sheikh says, I can say the pirates are part of the Mujahideen, religious fighters, because they are in a war with Christians and Christian countries who want to misuse the Somali coast. Is there anything else that sounds like there's a link there? So.
No, we have heard sentiments like that expressed, but we have not seen any evidence of formal funding or operational planning or encouragement in targeting as of yet. But it's because of statements like that that we watch this very closely.
Okay. Kenya, once it takes these prisoners, what's the punishment if found guilty?
None of these trials, there have been preliminary hearings, none of them, of the 52 suspects now there, have come to conclusion yet, so I don't know what their sentences, if convicted, will be, but do we, there's the ballpark. Yeah, there was a 7-year. Okay, yeah, there were some there were some convictions in 2006 for which 7-year sentences were given.
7-year sentences. So I don't know what the situation is with time off for good behavior or anything in that country. Have no idea. Maybe not. Who knows? But 7 years for piracy, which is the equivalent of kidnapping, I would think. It would be very similar. What's the punishment in the United States for someone who would be convicted of a similar crime?
Piracy in the United States could include life imprisonment.
Right, okay. It would seem to me that that would have more of an impact than 7 years in prison. Of course, 7 years in a Kenyan prison may be the equivalent of a lifetime in the United States. Let me just get back to one point about, rather than looking at the pirates as sort of independent players, the Puntland government, is it profiting from these pirates, the Puntland government and or the Ethiopian government? Because I understand that that's where they're operating out of that under that auspices.
Yes, our information indicates that the vast majority of pirate attacks are launched from organizations that are located within the Puntland area. The governor of Puntland has just in the past month expressed his eagerness for some of the security assistance you were mentioning earlier, Mr. Rohrbacher, in your opening statement, volunteering to take on a more activist role to undertake law enforcement in the area. But at the same time, I think it's indisputable that the relatively vast sums that are now flowing in and out of that area as a result of ransom payments does benefit not just the pirates, but also the people that live there.
Would you write off the possibility that the head of the Puntland government and maybe some high officials in there are actually Confederates, meaning they're just they're letting this happen and benefiting from it?
In this open session, I could neither rule it in or out.
I get you. Okay. So let's find out. How did the Puntland government become the Puntland government? Was this based on a free election, or were these the people who were put into power by the Ethiopian intervention?
I'm not, unfortunately, an expert on internal Somali politics, but I understand that this leadership emerged from a pre-existing clan structure that the leadership is chosen through clan councils who live in that autonomous region of the country.
Right, who are allied with either the certain Somali interest or allied with certain Ethiopian interests, and then that would happen. It's my understanding that the current government was actually allied with the Ethiopian efforts there, and has there been any indication of the Somali government in exile, which is now in Eritrea, which is been cataloged by us as a radical Islamic group? Have they? You say we don't have any evidence of Islamic extremism being part of this, but does that mean that the Somali government in exile has not been tied to this?
Are you referring to the transitional federal government, or
yes, the Somali government in Eritrea that's in exile in Eritrea?
Because I think that's another organization. I'll have to check into that further. So
right.
I'm not familiar with that particular organization, because
Okay.
The transitional federal government, the TFG, is now set up again in Mogadishu, and I'll have to check into that and get back.
Yeah, what I guess what I'm getting to is that perhaps the United States sided with the government in Ethiopia after the current, if you want to call it the government of Ethiopia, those people who lost the elections in Ethiopia were embraced by our own government, and the next thing we know, they are carrying our water by invading Somalia, and next thing we know is the area in which a government was placed in power by that government, Ethiopian occupation, ends up overseeing an area in which piracy is being conducted on international vessels. It seems to me that if you look back far enough, that really calls into question our relationship with Ethiopia as well as what's going on in Somalia. And that's just a thought. Now back to my one point, then I'll yield back my time, and that is the possible use of, you say there's been 40 vessels out there from various countries in order to thwart this piracy. Now, it seems to me that what we're talking about is a very easy, I mean, I know whatever challenge it is, we have to have lawyers, European lawyers working in Copenhagen in the working group. I understand how important that is to defeating this enemy. But in terms of the actual military confrontation that's going on, or let's say with armed confrontation that's going on, couldn't these people be deterred by just having private security guards on the ships, or having someone hired by the shipping companies to keep a protective cover in that part of the world?
Well, sir, you're right that that security on the vessels does have an impact, and however, it is a very complex thing as to how you put security on there, armed or unarmed security. Armed security is something that we are spending a lot of time right now in our government reviewing all of the ins and outs of armed security teams on board vessels. It raises a whole host of questions. It is being done by different companies right now, and in some of them it's being done successfully to deter attacks. It does require an awful lot of coordination, a lot of forethought, a lot of training. Having normal merchant seamen pick up weapons and then expect them to fight off pirates with rocket-propelled grenades and AK-47s is not necessarily going to work very well. On the other hand, well-trained private security or independent security teams that have practiced together, understand fields of fire, understand the basic rules for self-defense, when they can fire and when they can't fire at pirates that are approaching them. All of those things could definitely help. There are many other problems, though. The cargo on many vessels is totally incompatible with having a firefight. Obviously, petroleum products, other hazardous chemicals, so forth. A very difficult thing and could be very dangerous. There are other nations that have very different views on this issue, and there are many nations and many interests that think that this raises the danger to the crews and to the vessel, and will take this whole thing to a different level.
Those are the European allies who want to send the lawyers in. There's the ones who are
Well, there are many of them, sir, and there are also insurance interests that have a tremendous influence in what companies do in this particular area.
I understand the insurance interest in our European friends who think that we can hug people and be nice with them, and then they won't hurt us. If we can just set everything down legally, they'll disappear. Well, that's not going to happen. There are people in this world like those pirates, and I will tell you, pirates throughout our history have been the scum of the sea, and they are willing to, and historically have been willing to murder and kill, and these are the pirates, I believe, have the same willingness to do that, and I think it's up to us to have courage. If we can't face down this type of threat and take care of it, God help us for anything much more substantial. I would suggest that we can even do that through the private sector, I would recommend that we actually have a policy of encouraging ships that are going in this area to hire a private security protection, and I think that it would disappear. The problem would disappear.
Yes, sir. As I mentioned, this is actively being discussed and engaged, and what exact position and many of the things that you just said are right on the top of our plate, and actively being worked with all of the government agencies and industry and all of those interests involved right now, particularly with U.S. vessels.
Thank you.
And let me go now to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne. But before I do, in the event that any of our European friends are either in the audience or observing, through C-SPAN or whatever, I think it should be noted that the French, for example, who I know are admired by my friend from California, are probably the most aggressive in terms of militarily and by force dealing with this issue. And in fact, maybe this is inaccurate, but I understand the French have actually offered military escorts to the various vessels transiting through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden in the Cape of Good Hope, at a price, obviously. But is that a misstatement, or are the French actually willing to provide military escorts on private ships for a price? Have either one of you heard of that?
That the French government would pay for a private security firm to...
No. In other words, the French government
would ride on the ships, the military...
would place on private vessels, French military, presumably special operation teams that would be paid for by private vessels.
I'm not personally familiar with this, but I've been informed that there has been some discussion from the French and perhaps the Belgians on that issue, but I don't really have any more.
If you could follow up, I'd be interested, given, Mr. Payne.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and commend you for having this hearing. There's a pretty complicated issue that they're dealing with. Just for my colleague from California, the old pirates who were the scum of the earth and all that stuff, they don't live in they don't stay on the water like the old pirates used to do. Pirates used to just live on ships and roam around the world. These pirates don't live on boats. They try to, I guess, get the booty and go back to land. So there is a difference in the lifestyle. They're not the way it used to be. But actually, from what I've been able to understand, it's really some kind of cartels, criminal cartels these are not. I believe the last thing on the minds of these hijackers is some ideology of some Islamic, it has absolutely nothing to do with Islamists and anti-West and Al-Qaeda linked and all that. Matter of fact, as it's been indicated, there is absolutely no one in Somalia other than the criminal cartels that are doing it that appreciate that it's happening. The current government of Sheikh Sharif Ahmed even the government up in Puntland and in Somaliland and in Mogadishu, Sheikh Sharif Ahmad, none of them want it. The only people, like I said, that are benefiting is this group of criminals who have found a way to make some money. They're not giving to the Red Cross. I mean, you know, it's not assisting Somalis in general. It's just making some criminals, maybe some of the old warlords, you know, wealthy. But you know, I guess time is running out. The vote coming on. I did have an opportunity to speak with a broad group of people in Mogadishu a day or two after the ship was released, and actually, and I mentioned very clearly at a press conference that, with the Prime Minister, that I thought that the actions of President Obama and the Navy and the SEALs was appropriate, and that you know, criminality can't not be tolerated, and there has to be assertive action to end it. If there's no deterrent to ending this, it'll just continue. And there was absolutely no dissent from about 25 media people. So the government in particular doesn't see piracy. As a matter of fact, they say that, you know, it's just wasting a lot of time and effort to try to get the pirates out in the ocean. He says you got to deal with them on the ground, period. That's the way that you can eliminate it before they go. And they have a plan which they feel they could handle it. As a matter of fact, you know, Sheikh Sharif and the Islamic Courts Union ended the piracy during the 6 months they were in charge. But the U.S. backed Ethiopia to go in and dislodge the ICU, and they left. And that's when the piracy became emboldened. So I think that it can be dealt with if the new government is, you know, they're interested in having some training of their militia from it, maybe in Kenya somewhere or Uganda, and they are very assured that they can eliminate it on the ground, and I think that would make a lot more sense. You know, the three groups in Somalia: you have the government, you have the pirates, and you have Al-Shabaab. Now, Al-Shabaab is allegedly trying to get a foothold and linked to Al-Qaeda. The hijackers are criminals that have cartels, and they're, you know, so those two groups have money. The only group that has no money is the government, and they're the ones that want to end piracy, and we can't get the West to engage with the government. They said, we can handle this, believe me, we will have no problem. And as a matter of fact, we even got some intelligence from you know, the West to even assist us in locating them or seeing when they're planning to leave land. We could wipe them right out. And but the only ones that have no resources is the government. So, you know, we could spend a lot of money trying to go over all these oceans to try to run these guys down. And I'm not so sure the insurance companies care very much anyway. They're not hurting. Matter of fact, I think we ought to investigate the increased profits that the insurance companies are making with this new surcharge that they're charging. And of course, the shipping companies just put a surcharge on each container.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah.
I think that suggestion is one that we will pursue. And as I indicated before you arrived, Mr. Payne, what I anticipate is just a thoughtful but thorough review of all of these issues, because it is somewhat complex. And I don't disagree with the plausible theory that maybe insurance carriers are part of the problem and therefore a part of the solution here.
Oh, yeah, no question about it. You know, and you know, contrary to what I think the gentleman of California, there has been no, you know, the relationship between the pirates and the crew. I mean, it's just, you know, they're all sitting there waiting when the insurance company, when are they going to pay the ransom, so when I could go back to land and the other guys can get on with their business, drop their crew and go on. And so the holdup is not with the, and as you mentioned, there's been no reports of mistreatment on the parts of the crews of the ships from the hijackers, you know. And
Would the gentleman yield for one moment?
yeah,
Just to note, and I think it's a very important point that you're bringing up about insurance. If insurance, has the insurance gone up dramatically on these ships to insure the ships from this?
My information suggests that the surcharge that Congressman Payne referred to has primarily been imposed by European insurers. American insurers have not yet taken that measure yet, but then it's also because American insurance policies typically don't cover ransom payments the way European.
Of course, if insurance rates are going to go up, maybe there's your source of revenue for paying for private protection. There you go.
oh, absolutely. And also the flags of convenience. You really don't know who the ship really belongs to be honest, because they fly under the flags of convenience of either Panama or Liberia or Guam. And so it's very difficult to know who's, of course it was clear with the Maersk line, but I'm sure that some of those other ships out there are owned by American businesses. It's just that they have international crews, which also may be another thing that the insurance companies really don't care that much necessarily about. Some of the treatment of these seamen are not the best either. Many of them from third world countries with no rights, and they're not going to complain. It's the best thing they got. At least they got a meal going. They get a little something when the ship goes somewhere and they can get home. So I don't see whether there is necessarily, a tremendous amount of concern really for the crew. I mean, the crew's about the easiest thing those ships can get. I mean, people are waiting in the Philippines or in, other countries around the world to be seamen, and that's why the ILO and the flags of convenience had been a debate over in Geneva for decades about even the safety of the ships and the conditions, because when they fly under the flag of convenience, there is no jurisdiction from the countries that are doing the business. So I just concluding, we're running out of time, I think that the leadership of Puntland, Somaliland, Somalia really want to see this end, because it does absolutely nothing for the country, which are in terrible straits in the first place. I mean, Somalia has been abandoned for 15 years, and they're certainly not going to get anybody investing in Somalia with these gangsters doing what they're doing. And so I think that if in your thinking, the Department of Defense and the Navy and all that, in your discussions, like I said, I've been talking to these fellas up in Eritrea in August and in Mogadishu, as you know, a couple of weeks ago. They really want this thing to end, because they really are trying to see if they could, all the fish are gone after allegedly overfishing from Asian trawlers that just depleted the fishing. It's alleged that there's been dumping of toxic. If you got no government, you got no one to say stop dumping that. You got no Coast Guard, so it's allegedly been dumping of toxics and all kinds of things off the coast of Somalia. So certain doesn't condone, criminal behavior. However, there needs to be some kind of, if you got a failed state, you got to deal with it. We're trying to deal with Afghanistan, which is a lot worse than Somalia, believe me, and Iraq.
Okay, take care.
So I would hope that in the thinking, we will kind of figure out if we do something on the ground, we might be able to save a lot of increased insurance rates, and our ships riding all around. The ocean's pretty big, you know.
The gentleman yield? Thank
I'll
you.
turn
And
back.
I think your point's well taken. I mean, I would agree there has to be a comprehensive approach here. But I think what we need is to understand the various pieces so that sometime in the future we're able to have a more well-informed discussion with the agencies in the executive branch. I know that this is a learning curve really for all of us. But I think something that you said, Mr. Payne, really has to be underscored, is that those who dismiss an increasing reality, which is that there are failed states that exist, there is extreme danger. And despite the fact that Somalia is on a different continent, thousands of miles away from the United States, we are impacted. And we have states that are failed or near failure right here in our own backyard. I'm just thinking of Haiti, for example. And that's why it's important, I think, to create an architecture, a blueprint, if you will, or a plan that can be utilized in any situation where piracy emerges as a significant problem. And we ought to take the time, given the high profile that this issue has now developed, to really understand the problem, discuss it with all of the stakeholders, and proceed in a very thoughtful manner. And let me conclude with that and thank you for your participation, Mr. Payne, and to thank our witnesses. I can assure you we're going to ask you to return. We're not going to impose a burden on you, but bear with us as you guide us to a more full and ample understanding of how we address this problem, which has severe consequences for our national security and for our economy. I also, before I take the gavel, I want to thank some interns that have really done us well. And if they could stand, Carla Rojas and Leanne Blanchette. Today, they've worked here assiduously. This is their first hearing, and it's also their last day, but I want to thank them publicly for the good work that they have done. And with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.